Gordon, it's very difficult to decide how much we need to be afraid of China. But my very first guest, actually, Gordon Parton, was suggesting that China's economical situation isn't necessarily as rosy as it projects, and that a lot of this might be braggadocio and this sort of imperial assertiveness to try and paper over some emerging cracks. Would you agree with that?
I certainly would. If you look at the indicators for August, for instance, it shows that the economy is contracting on a month-on-month basis. We know that China has a terrible debt crisis with one of its largest companies, Evergrande, on the edge of default. And we're also seeing that in general, the Chinese economy isn't working very well. When you add in COVID-19 and Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler's Common Prosperity Plan, which is Maoist, he's really attacking the most vital parts of the Chinese economy. And long term, this means that China will not be able to maintain its momentum.
So what happens in the wake of that? Because the problem is, of course, that China is so heavily involved with so many big projects now in countries in Africa, in the developing world, all over the place, in Europe, basically the entire globe, that if it's now facing its own problems and it needs to start calling on those debt repayments to come back, it's got a huge amount of power at its disposal by the sheer fact that it's involved and integrated at such high levels throughout institutions and governments and universities. Is that something that, if China feels itself imperiled, that could potentially imperil us?
Well, certainly. And China is in peril because in addition to all those other problems, it now has a food crisis. And so I think that the Communist Party right now really does feel vulnerable. And that means it could be extremely dangerous. Xi Jinping wants an unprecedented third term as General Secretary of the Communist Party. He knows he's under attack from other senior leaders, and that means he could lash out. And we don't know exactly what he will do. But nonetheless, this is not a stable political system, and it's a country which is overstretched. It is a country which, as you just heard from Steve Song, is got ambitions and indeed can be extremely aggressive. So right now, the world, I think, is at great peril because of what China might do.
But how on earth can we row back from this? Because it seems to me a lot of the world have got themselves in a situation where if they try to stand up to Beijing, when it comes to things like human rights, if we wanted to sanction China, when it comes to the UK saying to China, well, come on, when you regained Hong Kong, that you were supposed to do that under a series of conditions which are no longer being met. But nobody's got a leg to stand on because they've got so heavily involved with taking Chinese money, having Chinese involvement in critical infrastructure projects that, it's very difficult to now stand up to Beijing. What on earth can we do if the relationship does start to sour?
Well, Alex, you're right. Political elites around the world, and especially in the great democracies, have been bought off by China. But we've also got to remember that China is very dependent on other countries. So, for instance, I live in America. Last year, China's merchandise trade surplus with the U.S. constituted 58.0% of its overall merchandise surplus. And of course, China is now really export dependent because of a number of reasons, more so than in the past. So the United States actually could affect outcomes in China by cutting trade, cutting investment, cutting technical cooperation agreements. We have the power to do it. The issue is political will. And this is a situation that the world faced dealing with other totalitarian states last century. And it didn't work out well then. And I don't know if we can be more optimistic about the way it's going to work out this time.
The US certainly talks a good fight, particularly under Donald Trump when it comes to sizing up to China. And, the West and China as well sort of interpret this as two giants taking on each other for global supremacy, for that sort of upper hand in dominance in trade, in commerce, in economics. But if the US do have these facilities to prevent imports and could push back against things such as Chinese dumping and actually use that strategically to actually hold China to account on some of its domestic policies as well, why on earth is that not happening?
Well, it's not happening for a number of reasons. First of all, as we talked about, elements of American society, like corporate boardrooms, Wall Street, are very much closer to Beijing than they are to Washington. But also, there's a feeling that China is dangerous and that therefore we should tread lightly. And also, remember, the United States tried for decades to integrate China into the international system because we believe that as it became stronger, it would become benign. And that feeling has not entirely gone away, although is proven not to be correct. There are no good solutions right now. We have got ourselves into a situation which is exceedingly dangerous, whichever path we go. But the point is, we need to start defending our societies because China is malicious. It's far more malicious than people think that it is. And we could be surprised, like we Americans were surprised on 9/11. We could probably be surprised again by a China, which is actually much more powerful than Al Qaeda. And the next time, China is not going to go just after the US. It's going to go after, I think, other countries as well.
When you talk about that, I mean, that sounds deeply alarming. When you talk about Chinese malice, what sort of things are we looking at? Spying, military assertiveness? Do you think they'd ever use sort of physical force against a perceived foe?
Well, let me give you one example. We don't know how COVID-19 started, whether it was a natural mutation or a lab leak, but we do know that Xi Jinping lied about contagiousness. He knew the disease was highly transmissible from one person to the next. But for weeks, they told the world it was not contagious. And at the same time they were locking down their own country, they were pressuring other countries not to impose travel restrictions and quarantines on arrivals from China. You put those two things together, and they're not the only things, but you put just those two things together, it shows that Xi Jinping deliberately spread this disease beyond China's borders. He had to know what was going to occur while they were lying about contagiousness and forcing other countries to set Chinese passengers, because those are the passengers that have now spread this disease and killed 4.5 million people as of today.
That's astonishing, isn't it? 4.5 million people dead around the world, but no one's really standing up to Beijing.
No, you're absolutely right. And this to me is inexplicable because, as I said, we don't know how this disease started. But we do know what Chinese leaders did to spread this disease, and that just shows a maliciousness which is beyond the comprehension of people in democracies. People in democracies have this weakness in that we don't understand totalitarians and communists. And although we'd like to think that they think like us, we know that the Chinese don't. And we know what China's actually been saying. And we Americans in particular have been oblivious to some of the really harsh and violent things that they've been saying, especially recently.
Blimey. Well, it's worrying stuff, isn't it? Gordon, thank you so much for coming on and giving me your take on this fascinating subject.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.